Welcome to Migdal Dialogues. This is Jonathan Ziring, and I'm here again with Rabbi Ben Aaronson. Today, we're going to be focusing on a topic that is a perennial interest of mine, and that is halachic process, and talking about why it's important, or if it's important, to understand the way that Psak is formulated. But for the most part, I'm going to turn over the questioning role to Rabbi Aaronson.
Thanks, Rabbi Ziring. I'm very excited for our discussion today. I think especially nowadays, where an aspect of the halachic process is perhaps more democratic than it's been in previous generations, just in terms of what's available online, what's available to be searched, and I think it'll be interesting to hear a bit how our halachic process has either evolved or not evolved to address not only the changes nowadays, but the accessibility of information that the average student has at their fingertips.
So I definitely agree with you, meaning I think how I first got involved in this topic in many ways was thinking about the way halachic process had changed in light of the increase in information that the average person has. But that made me start, not from the end, which is how things changed, but really trying to go back and understand halacha from the beginning, from, let's say, a bird's eye view.
Before we jump in too deep, let's start a little bit by defining our terms. Can you describe what you mean by the halachic process?
So the way I think about the halachic process is that for many people, they keep halacha. They know, they learn let's say the laws of Shabbat or the laws of Kashrut. And if they have a halachic question, so either they'll ask their rabbi, or maybe if they're a little bit more knowledgeable, they'll look it up in a reference book. And if they're even more knowledgeable, they'll look it up in, let's say, Shulchan Aruch or some primary source. But they often don't understand why there are different opinions and how a halachic decision is generated. And for me, I think it's really important for people to understand not just what the halacha is, but to actually have at least a basic idea of how we get from point one to halacha l'maaseh, from the beginning to the end. The Rambam, for example, just when he defines Talmud Torah, says that Talmud, at least one aspect of it, is understanding the path from Torah shebichtav, from the written Torah, all the way to Torah sheba'al peh, highlighting the fact that it's not just enough to know the conclusion. You actually need to understand how we got from the Word of God, from Dvar Hashem, all the way to what you might find in the sources that you're looking at. And when I talk about halachic process, I mean really understanding how and why a decision is made, all the way from the beginning, and understanding how it's formulated in the practical context.
And you're talking about when the Rambam defines Gemara or Talmud, about davar mitoch davar, going from the beginning to the end of a matter?
Yes, exactly. Right. When the Rambam defines Talmud, and he says that we divide our Torah learning between the written Torah and then Talmud, and says Talmud is both understanding the conceptual things, davar mitoch davar, and comparing things, but also understanding it from the beginning. And for me, there are many things I derive from that Rambam. One of them is this idea that to really understand Torah is to understand every step of the process from the beginning, from the very, very beginning, all the way to the end.
So I'm wondering if we can also distinguish between the halachic process that might exist for a posek, somebody who's a halachic decisor, who's making decisions for the community, who's being asked different questions, versus the halachic process that, as you said, an average person might go through. Maybe they have access to some sources. Is there a difference between those two halachic processes?
So I don't think there's a difference between the process per se. Let me explain why. First of all, I understand if you were asking me that question, is there a difference between, let's say, a 75-year-old Gadol Hador, like leading halachic authority, and a 75-year-old who's just beginning to learn and has no realistic possibility of becoming that leading authority because they just don't have the time to engage in that. But I don't think it's fair to make a sharp distinction. Torah doesn't function the way, let's say, the Catholic Church does, where there's a rigid authority, and you can say there's the Pope who has authority vested in his person, and other people. When we're training our students in yeshiva, right now, they're definitely not world-class authorities, but we hope that in 20, 30, 40 years, some of them will be. So to sharply distinguish the halachic process between the people who are already those authorities and people who are studying Torah is to not recognize the fundamental truth about Torah, which is it doesn't belong to some inherited oligarchy of Talmidei Chachamim. It's something that be given to anyone. And therefore, to say that there's two types of processes for poskim and not is to imply that not everyone has the ability to be a posek. That's point one. The second point, and this is something I learned from Rav Lichtenstein, is that not all halachic questions are created equal. And yes, there are some questions where the only people who can answer it are the Gadol Hador, the greatest authority, But not every question needs whoever, Moshe Feinstein, Ravadi Yosef, Rav Asher Weiss, whoever it might be. And therefore, an educated lay person does have the right and maybe even responsibility to answer, let's say, mid-level questions for themselves. And therefore, they are in some way acting, I don't want people to get the wrong idea, but at some level, they should be engaged in the process. And the third point is simply, even if someone is never going to paskin for themselves, to make it that Psak is not mysterious and magical is also important because it makes it easier for people to accept what they're hearing because they don't view the rabbi as just waving his magic wand and coming up with a conclusion that they don't understand where it came from. So I don't think it's fair to say there's a difference between halachic process for the posek and for anybody else because there isn't such a difference between those people, at least at a fundamental level. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's a helpful clarification. I'm wondering, since a portion of our audience is certainly yeshiva students, can you talk about what would be the steps as students coming out of high school, beginning to get a broader and hopefully deeper understanding of halakha? How would they approach this concept of halachic process as they're beginning to study halakha?
That's a great question. At some level, obviously, the answer is learn, and hang out around people who already learn it so you can learn from their example. But if you wanted to ask me how they could get involved, and let's say beyond learning Torah, there are a few things that I think are helpful. One is I encourage students to read the introductions to classic works of halakha, where they actually make programmatic statements of what they think halakha is. So, for example, if we talk about the most important halachic works, let's say of the last 500 years, undeniably that would be Shulchan Aruch with the glosses of the Ramah, Rabbi Yosef Karo's compendium of Jewish law with Rav Moshe Isserlis's comments on it, recording the Ashkenazic practice, and the more encyclopedic background found in the Beit Yosef. And if you would open up the Beit Yosef and you would open up the Darkei Moshe, which is Moshe Isserlis's commentary on the Torah, also somewhat encyclopedic, you would see that they both present two different visions of Psak. There are certain factors that everyone agrees are involved in Psak, but they emphasize different ones. So, for example, everyone agrees, as I put it, that there are three main prongs to Psak. One is understanding what the canonical sources say, like the main sources, the primary sources of halakha. The second is seeing how those sources have been interpreted by the main authorities over Jewish history. And the third is to understand how Judaism has been practiced by the people by keep halakha, or what we might call minhag, or maybe some historians will call nohag, what people actually practice to avoid the formal idea of minhag. And when you read the Beit Yosef, he'll tell you, well, yes, in theory, I want you to paskin based on the Gemara. But in practice, there's so much information out there, and there's no way you're going to think of something that the Rambam didn't. And therefore, he says, practically, Psak should focus on the precedent prong. And therefore, he says, I've collected all the Rishonim, I've collected all the early authorities, so that you know what they say. And then I'm basically going to make rulings on the majority of the Rambam, the Rif, and the Rush. Right? Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, Rav Moshe ben Maimon, and Rabbeinu Asher. So you see that on the one hand, he recognizes that, in theory, understanding the Gemara as a primary source is important, but his practical Psak is focused on precedent. And then he says, unless, right, you should follow my Psak unless your community has a different custom. So you see that he's incorporating all three of these elements while putting the highest emphasis on precedent, but recognizing that custom might override that. Rav Moshe Isserlis, while he says a lot of things, one of the things he says is that he was motivated to write his book because he felt that Rabbi Yosef Karo was not fair enough to the customs, especially the customs where the Ramah lived, and custom becomes much more important for him. And what you see is that in their introductions, they're outlining the main factors, but you see how, because of the different ways that they balance the weight of those values, they're going to come to different conclusions. And just by reading those introductions, you would begin to see the types of factors that poskim incorporate, and the way that even with the same information, poskim might weight those factors differently and come to different conclusions.
So you mentioned that as the Shulchan Aruch evaluated both the minhag, the canonical sources, as you put it, and how the sources have been interpreted, there's a certain, it sounds like, quantitative or numerical calculation. Do the majority look at it this way? Does the minority look at it this way? Is it always just about the numbers of opinions?
So for some poskim it is. And Rabbi Yosef Karo at least makes it sound like it is. And Rabbi Ovadia, who sees himself as following in Rabbi Yosef Karo's footsteps, really does take it quantitatively, though he does a lot more than that. And I don't think people give him credit for what he's doing in his Shuvot. But at some level, that's his rule, is that he counts up every source that has ever been written, whether or not we can access those books, whether they burned down in the library that he read in Alexandria before it burnt, and now it's only stored in his memory, and now only stored in Yabi Omer. But he just counts all these sources, and he weighs the sources and said, yeah, we follow the majority. Now, that's not fair, because A, that's not only what he does, and B, he weighs the majority unless it's against Rabbi Yosef Karo, or it's against him, and then he shifts it, and Rabbi Benny Lau wrote his dissertation on the methodology of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, and in an amazing, I don't know how many PhD dissertations have this, but it has a haskama from Rabbi Ovadia saying, yes, you got my methodology right. And he notes that, yes, that's one of his factors, but there are others. But yeah, certain poskim really do, at least on paper, sort of function in that quantitative numeric mode. Other poskim, like Ramosha Feinstein, do not at all. Right? If you look at Ramosha, you will get the emphasis much more of what do I think the canonical sources say. And when you actually read Ramosha Feinstein, there are usually very few sources that are quoted outside of, let's say, the Gemara and certain very, very key early sources. Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, the commentaries on the page of Shulchan Aruch, but he really doesn't care too much to quote the panoply of sources that there are. So it really depends on who you're talking about. But some poskim, the answer is yes. For many other poskim, the answer is very much no.
Right. You mentioned Rav Moshe, and he has a lengthy introduction to his Igros Moshe where he talks about his halachic process a bit. And he definitely emphasizes that he feels it's his responsibility to share what he thinks personally, independent of perhaps how it's always been interpreted. He's articulating a certain halachic reality as he sees it, and he says it's fine if other generations see it differently, but that's the weight that he feels on his shoulders.
You know, it's interesting you bring Ramosha's introduction. As I said, introductions are a great place to go if you want to start to think about the broad questions of Psak. And Ramosha's introduction is a great example because he says he's not writing Igrot Moshe for people to follow it blindly. He's writing it for other poskim to read, hear his opinion, and then decide whether they agree or not. So you actually learn a lot of things from Moshe's introduction. First of all, you learn that he thinks that Psak weighs much more heavily to your independent analysis of the primary sources. But the second is he also really downgrades the role of authority. He upgrades the role of primary sources by saying he's writing his tshuvot not so you rely on him, but to give you another data point when you try to figure out what the halacha is. There are other interesting things there as well, such as he doesn't think that the role of a posek is to try to come up with the objective truth in heaven. He doesn't think that's the responsibility of a posek. He says that there's the truth in heaven, and then there's the emet lahora'ah. There's the emet la'amito, the truth of truth, and then there's the truth of the purpose of psak. And he says he's not even bothering to pursue the truth in heaven. So you actually see a lot of very interesting things in his introduction.
So can we talk a little bit about that? So how is it that I would know that I've gone through the process accurately, even if it's not, so to speak, the truth in heaven? Rav Moshe is saying he goes through a process. I believe he has checked every source that's available to him. And I believe Rav Moshe also said he never had to retract a tshuva, right? Which is kind of a fascinating statement, given that, all right, there's new information that might come up. Maybe there's a source he hadn't seen before, but somehow his process has a degree of integrity. And so I'm interested in understanding how to imbue the halachic process with the integrity that Rav Moshe is talking about.
Let me make 2 points. One is going to be a very scary point, but I'll hold it off for the second point. The first point is there are 2 words that jumped out at me that you're talking about. One is process, and the other is integrity. I'll say I remember once I heard from my teacher, Rabbi Michael Rosenzweig, and he's published this as well in his article on Elu Ve'elu Divrei Elokim Chayim. He notes that there are 2 perspectives on whether there is objective halachic truth and we're just trying to uncover it, or there is not necessarily one truth in heaven, taking a very extreme view of either Elu Ve'elu Divrei Elokim Chayim. Both of these are the words of either the living words of God or the words of the living God, and several statements that appear throughout both the Gemara, Bavli, Yerushalmi, and the Midrash that in heaven there are 49 ways of declaring something pure and 49 ways of declaring it impure. So Rosenzweig notes that if you believe that there's a truth in heaven and you're trying to access it, and that's what you're trying to do in Psak, then it's unclear why process really matters. Because what really matters is that you're getting to the truth. The process might be the best way, but sometimes it isn't. Sometimes the iconoclast will have an insight that no one else could have. But if you think there are multiple truths in heaven, then what makes something legitimate psak is only process. is the fact that you went through the process, because there isn't some platonic world that you compare your psak to. What makes it legitimate is only process.
Right, and that's the lo b'shamayim that Rav Moshe talks about in his introduction. That
exactly.
He's emphasizing process is the ikar, and as long as the outcome has the integrity of the process, then it's a legitimate psak.
Exactly. So process is part of the answer here, and what that process entails is understanding, again, the primary sources, but very importantly, not just the source in front of you, right? Rav Shechter likes making this point. He takes it in quite an extreme form, but I think most poskim would agree to this at some level, is that to be a good posek, especially on real, new questions, when we talk in Psak about Psak, what we usually mean is new questions that require not just spitting back what's already been written, but actually incorporating it in new ways and applying it differently. You need to really know everything. So that's going to be the first step. And, sometimes the students say, everything? How can you know everything? I say, well, at some level, yeah, the answer is everything. The Rambam has a fascinating position where he says that the original people who had smicha, even though you could give them partial smicha and say, you are a rabbi only to rule on ritual things, you weren't allowed to give them smicha unless they knew and were capable of getting smicha in kol Torah kula, in the whole Torah. The Ravid says, I don't know why you would say such a thing. And the Kesef Mishnah says, because the Yerushalmi said such a thing. But the logic behind it, as I once heard from Rav Rosenzweig, is that real psak requires not just looking something up, but having an intuition of how the system works in general. And therefore, you need to know everything to answer something new. So at some level, to go through the process is first to learn everything, whatever we want to call everything, all of Shas, Bavli, and Yerushalmi. I don't know. Ask different people, you get different answers. But that's the first thing. The second is to look at, again, previous poskim, weigh it with the custom, and also to make sure that you have a tradition of how to analyze it practically. And I would say there are two ways of getting a tradition, and I think you have to do both. One is to have a teacher who themselves are part of the tradition and can show you how this works. Someone you trust to be part of the system to show you, well, this is how the system works. And the second is, my personal opinion, is you have to read a lot of responsa. Responsa, tshuva literature, is different than, let's say, a code, because it shows you how previous poskim have actually dealt with circumstances. So you get, as it were, virtual experience. And if you have the experience and you have the relationship and you go through the weighing all the different factors, right, at least your answer will have gone through the process. The integrity thing is a little bit scarier, because I don't think there is a magic way of knowing whether someone has integrity. I think it's not legitimate without integrity, and yet at some level, and I know this is scary for some people, and I know for students this is often scary when I say, yeah, you need integrity in the process, but I can't promise you have integrity, and I can't promise you the person you're asking has integrity. There is no magic. At some level, I just need to tell you need to have integrity. And I'll just very briefly say you see this in perhaps the scariest halacha in all of Torah, which is koach nitna biyad chachamim la'akor davar min Torah, that the rabbis have the ability when they need to, and I'm not going to get into the details of it, to uproot the Torah. So in that case, if it's a case where in theory the rabbis can uproot the Torah, literally the law is that the law can't constrain them. So what does constrain them? So if you look at the Rambam, the Torah, or Shulchan Aruch, when they quote this law, they finish it with bilvad shitkaven libo l'shem shamayim, that you have to do it for the sake of heaven, because the only thing that can constrain them, if the law can't constrain them, is integrity. I think that's true of the entire halachic process, is that at some level, someone without integrity, nothing can constrain them, but there isn't a magic way of saying that someone has integrity. Right? Nechama Leibovich used to say, as I've heard it from her, though I didn't meet her, unfortunately, that if you had no integrity, nothing stops you from reading the Aseret HaDibrot as rhetorical. And instead of reading it as don't kill, you should read it, what? I shouldn't kill? At some level, no text is safe if you don't have integrity. And I can't tell you what integrity looked like, but we all know it when we see it.
That's interesting. I want to circle back to one point we discussed earlier, which is you hedged a little bit as far as the distinction between, say, a posek and a student. But you've made a point here, whereas there may be a difference for someone who knows everything, somebody who's already been through Shas and Tur, Beis Yosef, Shulchan Aruch, and the surrounding commentaries, versus a student coming out of high school who assumedly has not mastered all those texts. Can you tell us a little bit how you would advise a student to engage in the halachic process when I think it's acknowledged that they don't know everything?
Sure. So in Psak, as I mentioned briefly before, there's the colloquial way we use that term, And then there's the formal way that we use that term. When you look at the halachic sources, so, for example, in the beginning of Huriyot and the relevant Sugyot in Sanhedrin, a formal psak, which has certain implications, such as you're not allowed to make that type of decision in front of your teacher, or you're not allowed to make that decision when you're inebriated. The formal definition of a psak is something that requires shikul hadat, that requires analysis, new analysis. Without that, it's not really psak. It's not really a halachic decision. If there's a halacha that everybody knows, you're not allowed to light a fire on Shabbat, so the Gemara calls that not psak, but zil kari beirav. Go ask the little kids in school, and they know it because they've read Chumash. I wish that was true of all little kids, but let's just take that as a given, that all the little kids know that the Torah says don't light a fire on Shabbat. Even if someone who doesn't know the law comes to me and says, can I light a fire on Shabbat? They could ask my 7-year-old. And he says, of course you can't. The Torah says, lo tevaru eish b'chol moshrotechem b'yom Shabbat. That's not psak. At the other extreme, there are new questions. So, for example, the things that have really been animating me recently are, how is halacha going to respond to things like artificial intelligence, where fundamentally the questions are new. So there is no book you can look at which will say, this is what you do, and this is what it means, and these are the implications. There, clearly, we need the people who know Kol Torah Kula, because where else are you going to look unless you have a mastery of the sources that can bring it to bear on a new question? Where it gets complicated are the middle-level questions, where, let's say, there is a lot of literature on it, and let's say there are 2 or 3 standard positions in the halachic community, one by the Mishnah Berurah, one by the Aruch HaShulchan, one by, let's say, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, in the Sephardi community or something like that. That's the level at which I don't think you need a first-level posek. You do need someone who's going to be educated, and that's where an educated yeshiva student, especially maybe not when he's 18, but he's been learning for a few years and a few years out of yeshiva and has a good number of years behind him, he might be able to start engaging in those questions, right? Where it's not from nothing. How he would do it? So the advice I once got when I first started getting halachic questions from one of my Rebbeim, which I still hold by, is that he said, when people start asking you questions, or you start answering them for yourself, what you should do is find your Rebbe who you trust. Before you ask him, go through the process, come to a conclusion. Then bring that conclusion to the person you trust and tell them, did I get it right? Did my process look legitimate? And if they say either, yes, that's exactly what I would have done, and you're right, or it's not what I would have done, but I think that's a legitimate way of reading it, do that enough times, and you know that, let's say, level halachic question, you are now skilled enough to answer those questions because the person you chose and you trusted tells you you're there. And then you constantly remain in conversation with the people you trust who are already further along in the process to gauge where you're standing. And I think that's a very helpful way to slowly go from being a pure, let's say, consumer to a producer of halacha.
And so that's interesting. You mentioned sort of in the same sentence, did I get it right versus did I go through the process correctly? And those potentially could be 2 different things. But if I understand what you're saying, the fundamental is really the process that you're asking for a haskama, so to speak, on from your Rebbe in that case.
I'm just hedging there only because I think while some teachers may be more comfortable saying to their student, you went through the process properly, and I think you can rely on that even though I disagree with it, other people are not. Other people are going to say, if you went through the process and came to the conclusion that I did, then that shows you're doing it properly. But fundamentally, I think it's more about process. And I've been in situations where I asked my Rebbeim and they said, I wouldn't necessarily come to that conclusion, but it's definitely legitimate and you can follow that psak. And for me, those are the types of Rebbeim I seek out, but I understand that not every person is comfortable doing that. But for me, I do think that's a very powerful mode, which focuses on process, which for me is more important in many ways. And the Maharal makes this point. The Gemara says that anyone who paskins from the Mishnah is mevaleh ha'olam, he destroys the world. Rashi there says, because you might get it wrong. The Maharal says, no, even if you get it right, the fact that you made a halachic decision without going through the process is terrible. And at some level, I'd rather you get the wrong answer, quote unquote wrong, whatever that means, and we can bracket that for a moment, but go through the process with integrity, then by accident, moral luck, I got it right. And at some level, for me, that Maharal very much resonates with me, that to be engaged in the process with integrity and with rigor makes the decision more right than happening to get the answer that my Rebbe would think was the proper answer.
So I'd like to delve a little bit deeper into the integrity of the halachic process. Sometimes as we're examining halachic issues, they can rub up against some of the societal values that can change depending on the year, the decade, sometimes changing more quickly than others.
These days it's probably by the minute, but okay,
yes,
fine.
Exactly. So how do we determine that we have full integrity in the halachic process? And if someone were to take into account, say, external values, does that distort the halachic process?
Okay, so that is a very loaded question, but let's try to take it apart a little bit. So first of all, unfortunately, as I've said several times already, you're never going to be able to ensure that you get to that. Not much you can do with that. But as much as you can, I would say the following. It's important to recognize that halacha itself recognizes that not every decision is going to weight the classic factors we talked about in the same way. Halacha has a category built into it called psikat halacha b'shat hadchak, making halachic decisions in extenuating circumstances. And the Gemara will say, Ra'ui hu li blank, normally Reb Shimon, but Ra'ui hu li, let's say Reb Shimon, l'smoch alav b'shat hadchak. You can rely on him under extenuating circumstances. Now, while some poskim, like Rav Moshe Isserlis, in his book Torah Chatat, basically only invokes that rule in cases where he thinks the law is really like, let's say, Rabbi Shimon, and just for whatever reasons, the custom is to be stringent against Rabbi Shimon. So then when there's pressure, we follow the primary halacha. Most poskim assume that there actually is, at some level, legitimacy to pushing the halachic system further than you would under normal circumstances when it's put under pressure. Now, why would that be the case? So Rav Lichtenstein, who is my guide for many things in life, has an excellent article that he published only recently, right before he died, only a few years before he died, but wrote like 50 years ago, called Ma Enosh, Reflections on Judaism and Humanism, I think, where he talks about this. And he says a few very important things. He says, first of all, many of the pressures that halacha is put under are internal, right? You're talking about external pressures, but the truth is that a lot of them are internal. So, for example, if let's say you would talk about an external value of, I don't know, economic equality, at some level, recognition of economic loss, hefsed mamon, is already built into the system. And therefore, under certain circumstances, those quote-unquote external values might actually have halachic language, or dignity is definitely part of the halachic category of kavod habriot, which the Gemara tells us explicitly has the power, in theory, to override certain laws, at least rabbinic laws, and according to the Yerushalmi biblical laws, completely. So first of all, you have to recognize that the values that can push halacha gain much more strength if those are recognized halacha values. The second is, Rav Lichtenstein gives a basic description of how you do it. And he says, look, when you go through the halachic process, by the end, it's very rare that you are going to be 100% convinced that the answer is forbidden and 0% convinced that it's permitted. Usually it's going to be, I don't know, 50-50, 60-40, 70-30, 90-10. And he says, look, if it's, let's say, 51-49, so at 51-49, if all things are being equal, then you follow the 51. But it doesn't take that much pressure, internal and maybe even external, we'll talk about in this in a minute, to push you to paskin like the 49. Whereas, if it was 100-0, you could never, with integrity, no matter what pressure was put on you, paskin like the 0. But if it was 80-20, that's when things get messy. And in halacha, the classic example would be, let's say, agunot. Classic agunot, meaning we're not sure if the husband is dead, where Chazal themselves say that b'makom igun hikilu rabbanan, that they're lenient, and therefore the tradition of Psak is to try to be lenient, not to approach it as if we don't have a bias. We do have a bias. That doesn't mean we're not doing it with integrity. It's just the question we're asking isn't, is this the most likely conclusion, but is it likely enough that under this pressure, I'm willing to rely on, let's say, the 20% chance that this is right or the 40% chance that it's right. That takes even more integrity because you're not asking, is this the most likely read? Is it likely enough for me to rely on it when pressure that might be internal to the halachic system pushes me to rule like that?
To clarify, that's an example of internal pressure within the system.
That's internal pressure.
Okay.
Yeah, that's internal pressure. It gets trickier with external pressure for two reasons. One is obviously that sometimes what looks like external pressure is internal. because maybe you just don't know the language. But like I said, in certain economic cases, it might be subsumed under the category of hefsid, which is itself a halachic category. But the second is obviously, if it's external, so as Rilchenstein notes in that same article, the only reason you're allowed to put the halachic system under pressure is because halacha itself recognizes those pressures as legitimate. If they didn't, then you couldn't incorporate it. Meaning halacha has the right, as it were, to ask you to give up your life. If it has the right to ask you that, then it has the right for you to go through extreme discomfort. So if halacha didn't recognize the pressure at all, then you couldn't incorporate it. But I would say that most people, when they talk about external pressures, the reason they feel the pressure is because they think those values are true. And the truth should always have a say in whatever decision we're making. And therefore, the challenge is not simply to know what power external factors have, but it's to figure out, how do I know that those factors are external and implied not Torah values, rather than, let's say, unarticulated Torah values, or values that I don't yet know how to articulate in Torah terms. And I think the answer, though it's hard, is that I think it's fair to approach a halachic issue knowing that you have a bias, as long as you recognize that that bias, let's say, has a voice and influences the way you look at a sugya, but it can't have a veto. The Torah always has to have the veto. Meaning, when you approach a sugya, you're allowed, and I honestly think it's dangerous to not acknowledge that. Because some people are so committed to approaching halacha with no bias, they pretend they have no biases, and therefore they don't realize they're interpreting the halacha in a biased way. If you are open about the fact that you have a bias and it's pushing you, so at least put it on the table. As I once heard from Rosenzweig, he said, look, it's legitimate. Rabbeinu Tam sometimes says, this was the custom. It seems to go against the sugya. What do I do with that? So Rabbeinu Tam goes back to the sugya and ends up realizing that there was something in the sugya he didn't see. So I would say external biases are legitimate to motivate you to reread the sugya and see maybe there's something you missed in the sugya. But it's never going to be legitimate to take an external value and allow it to override the value that you end up being convinced is the Torah value. And that's a very dangerous statement, I understand, but it's really important.
Can you perhaps give an example where our values have either changed or our values in, say, the general world have provided an opportunity or an impetus to examine a halachic sugya more closely, or even an example where halachic sugya perhaps butts heads with some of our external values?
Sure. Let me take an example, a value that's particularly, let's say, controversial, where I think there are cases where it has acted in the good way and has acted in the bad way. Again, I know I'm going to get in trouble because I'm going to say something controversial, but let's take feminism, okay? The belief, however you want to define it, that women should be treated with equal dignity and have equal participation in society. So let's say that people are influenced by that floating around in the air, even if they're not directly reading, let's say, feminist texts. So there are cases where that is going to motivate people to reread the sugya and realize there was something that they didn't know. So to take a relatively non-controversial example, should women, 3 women eating by themselves, make a zimun? So there it turns out that if you read the classic sources from the Gemara, through the Rambam, through Shulchan Aruch, the standard view is that women should or maybe are even obligated to make a zimun, and for some reason the custom was that it fell out of practice. So there, if you're committed to women's participation and that forces you to go back to the sources, you're going to discover that the halachic sources actually support the view that women should be doing a zimun. So in that case, maybe the reason a person was interested in this question was because they're quote-unquote feminist, but it's hard to deny that when you open up the actual texts, with full integrity, you will come to the conclusion that this is the majority view that women should be doing a zimun. On the other hand, it's pretty clear in halacha that women cannot count for a minyan. There, someone who was going to change that would be putting a lot more pressure on the halachic system. And there, in my opinion, and I think the majority of poskim's opinion, if not all of them, if someone would say, well, I'm convinced that women have to be equal and therefore they must count for a minyan, that would end up being a distortion. But the interesting thing about this example for me is that it's the exact same value. In one case, it would motivate me to relearn the sugya and come to what I think objectively is the better read of the sugya. And the other one, you might end up with the conclusion that, you know what, there is a difference between men and women. And therefore, I can't push it. And if I did, I would be doing it without integrity. So that's, I think, an example where it's not just that different values put halachists in different positions, but that the same value can sometimes properly motivate people to see things they didn't see before in the sugya, or to see things that aren't there.
Right. To actually twist the sugya in the latter case.
And again, what for me, what's striking about this example is that it's the exact same value that does both. And that's why it's very hard for me to give you a predictive rule, because it's not like it can say these values are in and these values are out, because I gave you an example where I think legitimately, at least in my humble opinion, that this exact value can sometimes lead you to read the sugya better and recover things that were somewhat lost. And in other cases, it can lead you to distort the halacha. And the fact that the same value can do that is just so much more dangerous, because I can't just give you a magic rule and say these values are in and these values are out. If I could, it would be much easier. And I'll just note here, this is the type of thing that I struggle with all the time. And that's why I think learning halachic process is so important, because we're all struggling with the social changes and technological changes of the modern world. And we're always under pressure to figure out how Torah speaks to the modern world. If you don't think broadly about what is halacha doing, how does it do it, then you won't have the tools either to generate halachic decisions, or even if you're a consumer, to understand why it's legitimate to maybe change a psak that has been traditional. Like in the case of Zimun, it's true that it wasn't traditional, but it was the better supported decision in the sources. If you don't understand how halacha works, then you'd look at it and say, well, why can you change there and not here? And that's why, for me, understanding the process enables both consumers and producers of halacha to understand that it's not magic and it can be done with integrity, even if it's complicated and there are no magic answers.
As we wrap up, for our listeners, can you give us someone or certain sources that would help a person follow some good examples of the integrity of the halachic process confronting modern-day issues?
So I think if people want a very easy, nice introduction to just the factors, Rabbi Mann at Eretz Chemda published a collection of the responsa that they published at Eretz Chemda. In the English, I believe it's called Living the Halachic Process. The introduction is actually very nice in terms of these factors, and also the article I mentioned by Lichtenstein Ma'enosh, which struggles with what I think the thorny problem of why Psak is different under extenuating circumstances, is a great place to go. But as I said, for me, the best way to understand this is to see halacha in action. And I would say that the two ways to do it are, one is to find not just a rabbi, but a rabbi involved in practical halacha, and ask them just to sit with them and talk through the halachic questions that you do. If you go on YU Torah, you'll find some by Rabbi Aryeh Leibowitz, who has an excellent series called From the Rabbi's Desk, where he literally walks through the process of how he comes to conclusions for questions that he was asked. Or you could just pick up, I think, Tshuvot. And now, these days, so many Tshuvot are not just published online and easily accessible, but published in multiple languages. You can read it and see how real poskim, who are getting real questions, are answering it in real time. And that, I think, is very helpful for people to see the way halacha actually works, not just by reading a Mishnah Berurah and seeing how it would work in a theoretical circumstance if it was perfect and followed the exact rules in the textbook, but how it plays out in real life. So finding real life mentors and virtual mentors, I think, is the best way. That's how I did, and that's how I continue to do it. And I'll just say that I wish there was a real book out there that I could point to that traces the process from A to Z. There really isn't much. And I'm not sure if it's because poskim mostly made decisions intuitively, and therefore they never felt like they needed to articulate it, or they just felt like they didn't need to write it down. Part of the reason that I've been teaching it for years is because I had the struggle myself, which is, what am I doing? Like I said, the short answer is learn Kol HaTorah Kula. Look, these are sources that I'm giving you, but at some level, the answer is you need to go through the classic works of halacha. You need to go to their introductions where they state their process, but then you need to read through it. It's not just enough to read, let's say, the introduction to Beit Yosef. You then need to read the Beit Yosef and say, okay, well, how did he use this process over and over and over and over again? There is no shortcut. I would tell people the same way that Malcolm Gladwell had his 10,000-hour rule, the answer might be the 10,000 tshuva rule or the 10,000 psak rule. There is no easy answer. You need to sit with real representatives of the tradition, both in person and in their writings, and watch how it plays out. And until you do that, you shouldn't do it yourself, right? Don't do this at home until you have that experience.
Right, and that's interesting practical advice, because sometimes you'll see online sort of someone weigh in on a controversial tshuva, but they don't really have either the background or you haven't seen them weigh in on anything else. They're just wading into this controversy without really demonstrating that they have the shoulders, so to speak, to deal with the complex halachic issue.
Right, and that obviously you can't do because, as I said, when it comes to real psak, right, those new questions, you really need to know everything. You need to know everything to even have an opinion. It just doesn't make sense otherwise. And that, I think, is definitely true. But hopefully this will just spur people to start learning and learning seriously. As I said to the students, and you were there a few weeks ago, I really do believe that people in yeshiva have the opportunity to be those poskim, but only if, A, they realize that they could be those poskim, but B, they put in the really, really, really hard work. And there is no shortcut. Anyone who's doing it and thinks they have a shortcut, they're definitely not the posek.
Thank you, Rabbi Ziring. This has been a really informative discussion today. I think clarified for me a bit of the aspects of the authentic halachic process and the integrity that's necessary to reach halachic conclusions. It sounds like there's a lot more we have to learn.
Okay, on that note, I hope that there's going to be follow-up from this. So feel free to reach out either through our website at migdalhatorah.org or our email podcast@migdalhatorah.org. Subscribe to our monthly podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Looking forward to hearing from you and continuing the conversation.